So, is Kevin Stefanski a good head coach? Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you are new here, then please do me a favour and hit that subscribe button. I'm only 2 subscribers away from 150, which is 148 more than I ever thought I would have, those 2 being my own account and my mum. So please, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Really appreciate it. So I'll be honest, I've been kind of looking towards this weekend. I wanted to do for my 100th video the full kind of why I'm a Browns fan, how I became a Browns fan. I get asked it a lot, and I've been kind of saving for that milestone for that video, which I am going to be doing this weekend. The only problem is that I was sat on 98 videos, not 99. So in a scramble to quickly try and get any form of a video out before Saturday, I was sat there thinking of what I could talk about. You know, I did the OTA videos the other day, so can't really, expand too much more on that. So I had a bit of a thought exercise, was trying to think of a video idea, and in that kind of thought, I thought back to a conversation that I had recently with another Browns fan that actually had nothing to do with the title or the thumbnail of this video, but eventually led me to a conclusion that I pretty much already had, shall we say, and that is that Kevin Stefanski is a good head coach. Now, I know this can be a controversial topic. I'm not going to sit here and bore you with arguments about X's and O's and start cracking out rush attempt stats and all of that. I feel like football is so subjective that you're never really going to get far arguing about those kind of things. I feel like people are pretty set in their ways on how they view stuff when it comes to football. So I instead want to tell you about the conversation that I had and why it led me to further my opinion on Kevin Stefanski. So essentially, the conversation was centered around how the Browns' misfortunes, especially over the last few years, just seem to, always keep coming. It's felt like every off-season and then, following season has been filled with turmoil over the last few years. Of course, yes, people can argue that that's a lot of the Browns are doing, but, mainly I think that is due to things that, in my opinion, are out of Kevin Stefanski's control or any head coach in that matter. From a disastrous quarterback acquisition, the ensuing suspension, bad play and injuries to, more injuries across the team and other genuine misfortunes. So in that kind of conversation, talking about all of those things that had happened, I kind of came to the conclusion of Kevin Stefanski has been through hell. He has dealt with a lot in Cleveland as a head coach, and obviously as a first-time head coach. This is the first team he's ever coached, and he's had the whole kitchen sink thrown at him. Let's actually take a look at each year since Kevin Stefanski became the head coach of the Browns. So obviously takes over for the 2020 season. He comes into an organization that has, has been the worst team in football for 20 years, for 2 decades. They've been the laughingstock of the NFL. They were coming off a season where, they embarrassed themselves after having just the slightest bit of expectation on them for the first time in 20 years in the 2019 season, and we all know how that went. So, you could argue that might be the most normal off-season was his first, but even then, he's coming into a team that, as I said, is just absolutely coming off a season where they've embarrassed themselves on top of the 20 previous seasons where, they've essentially destroyed the good name of the Cleveland Browns. And now, there's a whole generation of people that think that the Browns are the worst team ever because of obviously what's happened since reactivation. So he's coming and had to take over that. That's quite a big ask, shall we say. That's quite a big thing to come into. And what did he do? He won 11 games. Pardon me. He won Coach of the Year and beat the Steelers in the wild card of the playoffs. I know people will say, Stefanski deserves no credit because he was at home with COVID, which just ignores everything that he did to get the team into that position, in my opinion, let alone the impact he still had on that game itself. Regardless, nobody can ever take it away from us that we have a winning record against Ben Roethlisberger in the playoffs. And, Kevin played a big part in that, despite what some people might try and argue. Let's then go to 2021, probably the most normal off-season, you could argue. But then everyone knows how that season went. This is the Baker shoulder injury season. I made a, promise on this channel that I wasn't going to talk about Baker Mayfield anymore. It's been 5 years nearly, guys. But, we all know how that season went. Whether you blame Baker, whether you blame the team, it doesn't really matter. That was a big problem that the Browns had to deal with. Their starting quarterback could not throw a ball and refused to come out. Again, you can blame Baker, you can blame the team. I don't really care. But one thing you can't deny is that's a bit of a fuck up, and that is something that the head coach had to deal with. Again, I don't want to go too much into that season because, as I said, I get bored talking about Baker now, if I'm totally honest. I wish him all the best. I've got nothing against him, but it's been 5 years. It's time to move on. But besides the point, that was a tough season to deal with, all the injuries and everything on top of that. The next off-season, arguably the most eventful, shall we say. The Browns, of course, trade away Baker Mayfield and trade for Deshaun Watson. He is then suspended for the first 11 games of that season. So, Kevin's had to deal with the acquisition of Watson. You can argue that maybe he had something to do with it. I personally sit in the boat that he didn't, if I'm totally honest. I'm not saying that he turned down the idea. I'm not saying he was against it, but I don't think he was the one that went to Andrew Berry and Jimmy Haslam and said, guys, we need to get Deshaun Watson. I just don't believe that. So to have Deshaun Watson thrown on him, to then have to adjust his offense to Deshaun Watson, as well as obviously all of the off the field stuff. I mean, he must have had to have a lot of conversations with his wife, with his daughters, with his friends. It was a messy situation, and he had to basically cover for it. As the head coach of the team that traded for him, he couldn't speak out against it, even if he wanted to. So you think about that season, the mess that was. Of course, Deshaun Watson suspended for 11 games. Jacoby Brissett, serviceable. Kevin won some games with Jacoby. He actually had that offense rolling with Jacoby Brissett. But then, of course, the final 6 games you get Watson in. So essentially a write-off season, another season filled with, turmoil that Kevin Stefanski has had to deal with. The next season, the 2023 season, what happens? We all know. Watson tears his shoulder, everything that goes on with that, and yet the team still wins 11 games despite starting 5 different quarterbacks and having the highest percentage of their salary cap on the injured reserve out of any team to ever make the playoffs in NFL history. If that's not coaching, then what else is it? The team was without Nick Chubb for the whole year, so you can't even make an argument that they were carried by anyone. Other than Myles Garrett, but that goes without saying. People will say Jim Schwartz was the reason that, the Browns were successful that year, and, just by doing so completely ignore the fact that Kevin is the head coach. Don't get me wrong, Jim Schwartz deserves tons of credit for the defense that year. But despite, what some people seem to clearly think, Kevin isn't just the offensive coordinator, he is the head coach. Yes, he ran the offense, but he's still the head coach. And to disregard the head coach in any team's success is ridiculous, in my opinion. You don't not give credit to Dan Campbell because he had Ben Johnson and Brad Holmes. Everyone questioned whether Nick Sirianni would cope without Shane Steichen and Jonathan Gannon. And he won a fucking Super Bowl without them. So, the head coach does matter. But obviously, to have that season, I don't think, you could argue that no coach in NFL history has had that amount of shit thrown at them in 1 year. All of the different quarterbacks, all of the different injuries. As I said, 26% of their salary cap on IR, the most for a team ever to make the playoffs. The first team to ever make the playoffs starting 5 quarterbacks. That is coaching, and is an example of how, despite the turmoil, Kevin Stefanski was still able to be successful. Then obviously the 2024, this is the magnus opus of bad seasons for Kevin Stefanski. Of course, the team only won 3 games. But again, Watson, when healthy, was the worst quarterback in the NFL. He then tears his Achilles. So that's that. That's the starting quarterback gone. That's another season of having to go through and recycle through different quarterbacks. Tons of other, substantial injuries as well, including, of course, Nick Chubb. He only played 8 games last year. JOK, of course, after the Baltimore game, was out for the rest of the season. The team started 4 quarterbacks for a second year in a row. Just so much shit, and anything that could have gone wrong did go wrong that year for the Browns. So, overall, I think the point that I'm trying to make with all of this is that, the reason I think that Kevin Stefanski is a good head coach, X's and O's aside, is the fact that, despite the fact that his team has only had 1 normal season by NFL standards out of the 5 seasons that he's been here, he's still won 11 plus games twice. He's made the playoffs twice, including a playoff win at Pittsburgh, and he's a 2-time coach of the year. I think we're judging a head coach based on other teams when, this isn't a normal team. It's the fucking Browns. At this point, is it even a coincidence that every Browns head coach since reactivation and before Stefanski has failed? Maybe his shortcomings, Stefanski, that is, in a normal circumstance on a normal team, might be enough to justify claims that, he's not a good head coach or hasn't done enough. But, the man has coached through as much hell as any Browns head coach before him since reactivation, yet has still been more successful than every single one of them. More 11-win seasons in 5 years than the team had in the previous 30. More playoff appearances in those 5 years than the team had in the previous 22 seasons. That's an undeniable fact. That's not subjective. That's not an opinion. That is a fact. And, I think Leroy Hurd came out with a comment about it saying, the success that Kevin Stefanski has had despite the turmoil, and, people respond to that saying, what success? And, we can't just hold success with if you've won a Super Bowl or not, because if not, then, 99% of every NFL coach is unsuccessful and is terrible. Yes, we would like more. I would like more, and I want to see more. Otherwise, maybe these conversations do happen. But, for what he has achieved in those 5 years compared to what the Browns have achieved the previous 30, that's undeniable. And I think to just deny that is silly, and just shows, you're not actually talking about it from a objectively, but instead just kind of, you've made your opinion and that's how you're kind of going off it. Now, I'm not saying that he's the best coach in the NFL. I'm not saying he's perfect. I'm not saying he's an amazing head coach. But he's better than anything we've had since Art Modell took the team to fucking Baltimore. In my opinion, the constant sacking of coaches and GMs was part of the problem for the Browns over the last 20 years before this current regime. They were never able to build anything. I don't think it's a coincidence that the first time that the Browns stuck with a regime, it's produced more success than all of those previous regimes combined. Again, I'm not saying he is perfect. I don't think Stefanski is the best head coach in the NFL. And, there are things that he can do, or rather not do, that could one day lead to me calling for him to be fired. Nobody is immune to that. I'm not going to never get to that point because I just really like him or something. This is just the way I see it as the head coach, not the person. And I'm just entirely against sacking someone who I think is a good head coach in the NFL for the sake of sacking them. I don't know. I can't stress it enough. I'm just so against that and think that is just one of the most stupid things you can do as a team. Again, not saying he's perfect. I'm not saying he's the best head coach, but I think he is a good head coach. This is not me saying that he's been more successful, like he's done. I think he's a bit. No. I think Kevin Stefanski is a good head coach, and there are plenty of people in the NFL that agree with me. Listen to any other coach talk about Stefanski. Listen to any other, employee of a team. Listen to any of the pundits. I know, obviously, Dan Orlovsky's a big fan of him. Not that that's the best endorsement you can get, but it's not. I'm not just singing this into the wind, and I'm just a random guy, the only person that thinks that Kevin Stefanski is a good head coach. This is a pretty consensus agreement across the league that he is a good head coach. It only seems to be Browns fans that seem to actually question it. Now, I've been a defender of Andrew Berry in certain areas for a while, but, relating it to Stefanski, even with that being said, I would 100% say that, I personally believe that Andrew Berry's job should be more in question than Kevin Stefanski's. I'm not saying to fire AB, not even close. That's not at all what I'm saying. I just think he holds more responsibility for the team's up and down seasons over the last few years than Stefanski does. He deserves the more kind of brute for the Browns draft picks have gone. Obviously, the acquisition of Deshaun Watson. So I don't quite understand why it always seems to start with Stefanski. As I said, I think Stefanski is a good head coach, and I've got an arsenal of X's and O's arguments. If anyone really wanted to get into it with me, we can go into that. But as I said at the start, this was more so just I had the conversation about kind of just. The Browns the last few years, well, I'll say the last few years, since reactivation, it just seems to be one thing after another. When are we ever going to just get a normal season, blah, blah, blah. And kind of in that conversation, I'm sat there thinking, wow, that's actually a credit to Kevin Stefanski because, we've had one disaster season out of those 5. When we won 7 games and 8 games, you could argue they're disasters, but then, not in Cleveland Browns standards are they disasters. Winning 3 games is a disaster, especially when, the team had arguably as much expectations as they've ever had. But again, how much of it is coaching and how much of it is just the absolute shitstorm that gets thrown at this team every single year. And even despite that shitstorm, Kevin Stefanski has been more successful than any Browns coach before him since Bill Belichick. So, let me know what you guys think in the comments. I know this might be a controversial kind of opinion. I know, on Twitter it seems to be that a lot of people, the big argument on Twitter, and no, not obviously Elon Musk versus Donald Trump. Although, shall we talk about Elon? No. There's the kind of arguments on Twitter always seem to be about, fire Stefanski. I mean, people are calling to fire Stefanski in June. I don't even understand how that's a thing. I've seen accounts, say, this is not a real quarterback battle. He's lying to us. We need to fire Stefanski. It is June. Apply that to both. Apply that to the quarterback battle because, I don't think people seem to understand how a quarterback battle works. You're not, you don't decide the starter in June. People are moaning about the rookies not getting enough. It's June. We've had 2 OTA practices. If you're going to be outraged, save it for training camp if it's still happening then. But the same applies to Stefanski. Why on earth people are talking in June about sacking Stefanski is odd to me. And I think it's odd even during the season. But probably gone on a bit of a tangent. As I said, this wasn't a planned video. This was me trying to fill that 99th video before I do my How I Became a Browns Fan for my 100th video on the weekend. But, the conversation that I had has actually kind of come in clutch here because I've managed to talk about it for about 20 minutes. So I'll probably end it there. Kevin Stefanski, in my opinion, is a good head coach. And I don't think that the Cleveland Browns should sack a good head coach for the sake of sacking a good head coach. If it continues to go downhill, the Browns don't improve next season. They don't improve at all, and it's quite clear. Then yes, we can revisit this conversation. But for now, Kevin Stefanski is a good head coach, and I'm glad that he's the head coach of the Cleveland Browns. But that would do it for me today, guys. As I said, I've got a video coming out this weekend, my 100th video on why I became a Cleveland Browns fan. If you're thinking like, well, it's only going to take 2 minutes, it's quite a long story. There's kind of multiple facets and multiple parts that make up the whole thing of why I'm a Browns fan. So I'll do my best to explain that. So make sure you check that out when that's out. But again, thanks again for watching. If you do enjoy my content, then please drop this video a like, hit that subscribe button. It's free, but it really, really helps out my channel. You can also check the links in the description to see where you can follow and interact with me on social media. As I always say, I'm trying to build a community of Cleveland Browns fans, and even if that means I only get to talk to one fan a day, I'm happy because I'm talking Browns football with the best fan base in the world. Thanks again for watching, guys. Have an amazing weekend. But most importantly, go Browns.